Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. A quick thanks for all the support over the last couple of videos, I really appreciate it. It was the mid-90s. Bungie, fresh off a developing Marathon Durandal, were looking for a fresh new direction to take the studio. They eventually settled on fantasy and RTS genre. When fleshing out the world, they took a lot of inspiration from Braveheart and Irish folklore, deliberately avoiding many of the typical cliches that had influenced the fantasy genre for decades. Releasing in 1997, about a year after Command & Conquer Red Alert, and almost 2 years after Warcraft 2 released, Myth the Fallen Lords strove to do a couple of things differently. For starters, the game doesn't feature base construction, an economy, or the ability to mass produce troops on the fly, all of which have been conventional staples of the RTS genre from the very beginning. Instead, you start each mission with a scarce number of troops. In a handful of missions, you will receive reinforcements once you reach a specific section of the mission, or when certain milestones are met. But in most cases, the troops you started with are the troops you will have to depend on for the entirety of the mission. This forces you to treat every single individual unit as an invaluable resource, and almost every encounter in the game as a challenge that can render completing the mission impossible, even if you manage to survive. The loss of all of your dwarves, for example, can easily result in your warriors becoming outnumbered and outflanked. The loss of your warriors in turn will leave your squishy archers and dwarves entirely defenseless. In Myth, every unit has a defined role to play in the sandbox, and it's up to you to use those units wisely. Written by Jason Jones, Robert McLeese, and Doug Zartman, Myth takes place in a world engulfed in a war that threatens to usher in the next phase of a cycle that is repeated for thousands of years. For hundreds of years, the world of Myth had known peace, until a dark warlord by the name of Balor appeared. Alongside his lieutenants, collectively called the Fallen Lords, there was the Watcher, Soulblighter, Shiver, and the Deceiver. Balor and his lieutenants rose an army of the undead, and together they persuaded 3 races to join their cause: the Fetch, the Ghoul, and the Trow. The Fetch are pale and lanky, with horns on their heads. The Fetch traditionally graft the skin of those they kill onto themselves as a trophy. They generally have a low health pool, but they can dispose of an entire legion of clustered soldiers. Unlike the other races in the game, they are not native to the world in which Myth takes place, but were brought here by Balor to serve him. The Trow are massive giants created by the goddess Nyx near the beginning of history. The Trow had ruled their territory with an iron fist, enslaving smaller species like humans and the dwarves for centuries, until the Trow had been imprisoned by the hero Connacht in a realm called the Tane, where they remained imprisoned for nearly 1,000 years until Balor returned to free them. The Ghoul are swift creatures with an arched humped back, whose knuckles practically drag on the ground. They were long-time enemies of the dwarves, nearly conquering all of their lands until Connacht rose and forged an alliance with the dwarves to push them back. The Ghoul's one goal in life is to flank your weaker units like your archers and dwarves, ruining your day in the process. 1,000 years before the events of the game, the lands were also under attack by a warlord, an incarnation of the Leveler. In that age, Connacht rose up and defeated the Leveler. He and his allies forged a golden age that lasted centuries, but this was not the first time the Leveler appeared. According to the laws that govern the Myth universe, the forces of the light and darkness successfully laid claim to the land. Each cycle was marked by the arrival of a comet, which foretold the rise of a savior, or in turn, a destroyer. Each golden age gave way to one of darkness, and in turn each dark age would lead to one of light. The Leveler, a quote-unquote transient divinity, had appeared many times throughout history. Each time his body was destroyed, but his spirit survived. You see, the hero who defeated the Leveler and ushered in a new age of peace was doomed to return bearing the mantle of the Leveler to usher in the new age of darkness, as the transient Leveler would assume control of his body, gradually overriding his personality. Connacht, who had risen to defeat the Leveler Mogum 1,000 years before, had forged an empire that brought peace to the land, only to return bearing a new name: the aforementioned Balor. Balor resurrected his former lieutenants, the aforementioned Fallen Lords, and together they threatened to end the very golden age that they had helped create. Myth the Fallen Lords begins 30 years after Balor's first assault on the realm. In the time since, much of the civilized world has been raised by Balor. The forces of light, led by heroic leaders called the Nine, a name later used by Bungie in Destiny, rise to defy the forces of the dark. The Nine were led by a man of royal descent named Ulrich. 12 years before the game begins, armies of the dark led by Soulblighter attack the city of Covenant. Ulrich himself just barely survived, thanks to being smuggled out of the city by Moriak, another one of the 9. As the game opens, Shiver, one of the fallen lords, is sieging the free city of Madrigal, where most of the forces of the light have gathered. Our first mission of the game, however, is much more humble. We are tasked with defending the small village of Crowsbridge before rejoining a larger force stationed in another town closer to Madrigal, with the eventual goal of flanking Shiver's offensive line and attacking their base camp, luring some of their forces away from the main attack. Unfortunately, we never get to participate in the main events themselves, but we learn that the forces of light successfully repelled Shiver's forces. Just as the game begins, the 9 discover a mysterious head without a body buried underground in the desert just outside of Madrigal. The head, using magic, is able to communicate and claims to be a former commander in Connacht's army and a former enemy of Balor. The enigmatic head claims to have a beef with Shiver and tells the 9 that Shiver's weakness is vanity, and the head teaches the 9 how to exploit this weakness. Explaining this part is a little tricky, but an interesting anecdote in the official Myth comic book claims that the ogres are so old that they have memories of the quote-unquote waking world. And elsewhere, we're told that the entire realm of Myth was created by the dream of a god figure called Weird, or Word, depending on the pronunciation. Weird is an Irish word for fate, or crucially destiny. Additionally, many of the magic abilities in the universe are referred to as a dream. I think the idea is that somehow the magic user is tapping into and influencing Word's dream in a very specific way with their own mind. Sort of similar to how the mages in Dragon Age tap into the dream world of the Fade in order to use their magic. So when Rabican exploits her vanity in a dream duel, I think the general idea is that by tainting the purity of her mind state, he weakens her resolve or her focus. After Shiver and her forces are routed outside of Madrigal, Rabican sends us to retrieve a magical item we've learned of thanks to the head. And so we are sent through a world knot, a kind of magical portal system marked by 4 purple pillars. Rabican intends for us to retrieve a book called the Total Codex from a library in the city of Covenant, which contains a record of every major defining moment in history, including events that haven't even happened yet. Naturally, whichever side of the war obtained the artifact and was able to exploit it would have a massive advantage going forward. One of those who had retrieved the Total Codex turned to a random page and read a prophecy about a man not yet born who would one day resurrect the Mycaridia, a race of flesh-eaters that had plagued the world for hundreds of years before Connacht had risen to defeat them 1,000 years earlier. This isn't really relevant now, but it will be when we get to the second game. A series of events not necessarily of utmost importance happen. The Deceiver, another fallen lord, is marching alongside a large military force to the Cloud Spine, a thick mountain range in the northern lands covered in thick snow. Much of our army is stationed in a choke point in the mountains, planning to cut the Deceiver off. But we are tasked with destroying a world knot which the Deceiver could potentially use to flank us. In Myth, many of our missions are framed as a small but important part of a much larger battle, giving the story a sense of scale that's not really evident in the gameplay for a variety of reasons. The Deceiver's forces are successfully repelled and retreat, hoping for the path to clear when the spring returns. But the Legion still have to worry about the Watcher's forces, which are already past the Cloud Spine. Unfortunately, while the northern armies have succeeded, Ulrich was instructed by the head to march with the southern armies directly for the mountains, right where the Deceiver's forces had been waiting. And the Deceiver successfully routed his army, and Ulrich himself had been subsequently captured. 5 champions volunteer to make a daring rescue mission attempt. Ulrich, upon being rescued, insists that he must have been betrayed, presumably by the head who had sent him on the suicide mission in the first place. The head is probably one of the most interesting elements in the story, and one of the elements most surrounded in mystery. Debates about who he was or what his intentions were one of the most interesting debates in the Myth community. These questions were all given answers in a third game, but given that the game was a prequel developed by a different studio without any input from Bungie, many in the Myth community don't really consider the answers it gives to be authoritative. The Fallen Lords were full of division within their ranks. The Deceiver and the Watcher, for example, example, had an ancient rivalry. This is in spite of the fact that we are told that all of the resurrected fallen lords are apparently bound to Balor, and we're told that their power would dramatically weaken if he were to die. The forces of the light seek an alliance with the forest giants, and hoping to convince them to come to their aid, come to their home of the Forest Heart. They succeed, but Ulrich and a considerable contingency of his legion are ambushed by Soulblighter, who imprisons them in the Tane, the same realm Connacht had imprisoned the Trow and Mycridia 1,000 years earlier. The Tane is a dark, decrepit underworld realm that seems to be predominantly home to spiders. The legion fight through the realm, and at one point Ulrich obtains a flag standard of the Mycridia. This isn't relevant now, but it will be relevant later. The forces of light escape the Tane, and as the war continues, we are tasked with holding off Soulblighter's forces in a swamp to buy time for Ulrich to spring his trap on the Watcher. Ulrich had created several arrows tipped with fragments of bone from the Watcher's arm. Using these arrows, Ulrich was able to turn the Watcher into stone, leaving him paralyzed and helpless. An entire legion of Ulrich's forces attempted to shatter the Watcher, but all of those men died. Now we are tasked with finishing what they started. The Watcher is surrounded by a legion of troops, sworn to protect him. In my experience, by the time you actually make it to the Watcher, you have just enough men to spare to finish the job in a suicide mission. And so I usually split up my forces and use one group to draw aggro and create a hole in the defense, and then use a second group to finish the job, smashing the Watcher into 1,000 small pieces. But while the forces of light were distracted with the Watcher, the forces of darkness returned to Madrigal, sieging the city in their absence. Ulrich and the Nine decide their next plan of attack, concluding that focusing on defeating Balor was the best path forward, reasoning that because all of the Fallen were bound to him, the armies of Dark would all collapse in his absence. Ulrich and the forces of light strike Balor's fortress, and Ulrich sets up a banner of the Mycridia, who, as we mentioned earlier, were great adversaries of Balor 1,000 years earlier back when he was Connacht. The banner lured Balor out of his fortress to question why Ulrich would do such a thing.
Where did you find that accursed thing, Ulrich? And what madness made you raise it here?
To which he simply responded,
"As a lesson in humility, Balor."
Then I have a lesson for you as well.
Ulrich and Balor finally have their final encounter, during which Ulrich bounds Balor with magic, freezing him in position, giving the rest of the party an opportunity to strike, allowing them to weaken Balor.
Kill him! Kill him!
Once Balor was weakened, Ulrich finishes the deal by severing his head from his body. The final part of Ulrich's plan involves taking Balor's head to the Great Devoid, a massive hole that allegedly contains a bottomless pit. Created in ancient times by the Kaliak during a final confrontation with the Trow, when we arrive at the Great Devoid with Balor's head, Soulblighter is there to intercept us. We are tasked with passing through the Dark's forces and throwing the head into the Black Void. In my experience, Soulblighter is probably too difficult to take head on. Instead, it's far easier to split your troops into two groups, and to use the group without Balor's head to bait Soulblighter to one side of the Great Devoid, leaving little in the way of opposition for your little dwarf. The game ends with us throwing Balor's head into the Great Devoid, resulting in a large explosion that goes completely unexplained. Many questions go unanswered. The fate of many of the fallen lords is still in question. The identity or goals of the head remain unsolved, and we don't even know what the Great Devoid even is. This reminds me of something Matt Sowell had once told Hamish Sinclair, the manager of the Marathon story page, about the various plot connections in Bungie's games, and I quote, "Things are often more related than they first appear. For example, there is no obvious similarity or connection between the Marathon world and the Myth one, but then there's the Great Devoid." According to Hamish Sinclair, Matt wouldn't reveal what was at the bottom of the hole. And with that, we have reached the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, feel free to leave any constructive criticism you have down below. If, however, you did enjoy the video, I would greatly appreciate it if you chose to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or maybe share the video with a friend who you think might enjoy it, because any of that would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, thanks again, and have a great night, and stay safe with all the craziness out there.